Good afternoon and welcome to today's meeting of the LaRouche Organization's Manhattan Town Meeting. I'm Dennis Speed, and this is Saturday, July 17th. In a week, the Schiller Institute will be hosting a meeting, which you'll be able to see here and on the Schiller Institute channel. And it's an international virtual conference. And the theme is, there is no climate emergency. Apply the science and economics of development to stop blackouts and death. Now, there are many elements to the present emerging crisis that the world has been plunged into. There's, of course, the new developments around the coronavirus pandemic. There's the new circumstance that has presented itself to the world around the case of Afghanistan, about which we'll hear a little bit more later. And there is the background accelerating collapse of the international monetary system, a collapse which threatens to engulf the world in a process even more lethal than the combination of the coronavirus pandemic and the danger of war. To address these circumstances, the Schiller Institute will be hosting this conference, which will happen this next week. But within the confines of doing that, what is being emphasized continually is a particular proposal that has been made by Helga LaRouche, the founder of the Schiller Institute, which involves the creation of a World Health Platform for the security of humanity as a whole. And from that standpoint, Helga LaRouche has also devised certain particular policies and programs about which, again, we are about to hear a bit more. Before we go to a brief discussion between Harley Schlanger and Helga LaRouche, specifically about the Afghanistan circumstance and the possibility for change that it actually offers the world, we want to take the opportunity to reference the deeper problem that humanity faces, which is holding on to axioms that are now either obsolete or were always obsolete because they were always wrong. The inability to grapple with the reality of the coronavirus, for example, and the fact that it's a worldwide pandemic and it requires a worldwide solution, keeps plaguing particularly the governments of the transatlantic sector. And therefore, we keep getting this, wear your mask, don't wear your mask, get vaccinated. Oh, some people don't think we should get vaccinated. Vaccines are bad, vaccines are good. We get many different things being said, including by government leaders, and people have lost trust. Obviously, there have been other matters because of which people have lost trust. And what then happens is that you get a kind of despair in which it's claimed that there is no solution. But of course, that's not true. The poet Dante Alighieri, who died 700 years ago, back in 1321, wrote a very famous poem called the Commedia, the Comedy. And it begins with a song, with a canto, which we're going to play you in Italian, but we have an English translation which will appear on your screen. And it, I think, well characterizes the plight in which humanity finds itself today.
Nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita mi ritrovai per una selva oscura, che la diritta via era smarrita. Ah, e quanto a dir qual era e cosa dura, esta selva selvaggia e aspra e forte, che nel pensier rinnova la paura. Tanto amara che poco è più morte, ma per trattar del ben che vi trovai, dirò delle altre cose più scorte. Io non so ben rider come vi entrai, tant'era pien di sonno a quel punto, la verace via abbandonai. Ma poi che io fui al pied d'un colle giunto, laddove terminava quella valle, che m'avea di paura il cor compunto, guardai in alto e vidi le sue spalle, vestite già dei raggi del pianeta, che mena dritto altrui per ogni calle. Allor fu la paura un poco cheta, che nel lago del cor m'era durata, la notte ch'io passai con tanta pietà. E come quei che con la lena affannata, uscito fuor del pelago alla riva, si volge all'acqua perigliosa e guata, così l'animo mio, ch'ancor fuggiva, volse a retro a rimirar lo passo, che non lasciò giammai persona viva.
Lyndon LaRouche once used the image of a swimmer that had just escaped drowning to ask a question. is the swimmer who just barely escapes drowning, does that constitute durable survival? And his answer was no. One does not want to get into the position of being a drowning swimmer who may or may not be able to save himself, may have to be saved by someone else who may not be there. It's not the way to run a civilization. And where we are today in this 20th anniversary of the United States entering the Afghanistan war and the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attack in New York, Washington, and Pennsylvania, is a time in which a reassessment is occurring, and there are forces around the world who are involved in this reassessment. In specific, Harley Schlanger had a discussion with Helga Sepp-LaRouche about this very matter a few days ago.
Hello, I'm Harley Schlanger. Welcome to our weekly dialogue with Helga Sepp-LaRouche, the founder and chairwoman of the Schiller Institute. Over the weekend, Helga issued a very significant strategic memo on the potential with the withdrawal of US and NATO forces from Afghanistan for there to be a move into a new era of cooperation, a prospect for that which seems to be taken up at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting underway now. Helga, what can you tell us about what's going on at that meeting?
Well, there is obviously a very great attention by all the neighbors of Afghanistan who know that, if things go well in that country, it's good for them. But if this would become again a source of opium production and trade, terrorism, then it would affect the entire region and all the neighbors. So therefore, there is a very big interest to find a stabilizing approach. And there is a very important meeting by the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in Dushanbe, where Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, just reiterated the need to make sure that separatism, terrorism, and extremism are not gaining ground in Afghanistan, and that there must be a cooperative approach to build up the country. Now, obviously, the Taliban has expressed interest in cooperating with China, and I think both the previous President Karzai and present President Ghani have at various points said that they are interested in collaboration with the new Silk Road for Afghanistan. So there are hopeful signs that that could actually be accomplished. And I think it's also very useful and important that the two foreign ministers of China and India, Wang Yi and the External Affairs Minister Jaishankar from India, met on the sidelines of that SCO meeting. And that is also important because, India in the past did not cooperate with the Belt and Road Initiative, basically because they don't like the CPEC, the Economic Development Corridor China has with Pakistan. But now the potential exists that that CPEC corridor be extended into Afghanistan and then beyond into the Central Asian republics. So in that sense, it would be really very good if the Indian idea of connectivity, which essentially is the same thing, to bring in infrastructure development in the entire region from, South Asia, Southwest Asia, and in that way stabilize the situation. So I think this is all very promising, but not yet in secure terms.
You may have noticed on the map that the China-Pakistan economic corridor showed the border of the nation of China. We want to bring up a map of Afghanistan to reference something here people can think about. So you see there on the far right, upper right-hand corner, northeast corner, that area in the yellow stretching over to China. So Afghanistan is bordered, therefore, by China, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Iran, and Pakistan. The meeting that Helga Sepp-LaRouche referenced in Dushanbe was in Tajikistan, and you see it there. It's the capital of Tajikistan. And that's where the members of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization convened to begin to talk about what should be done about Afghanistan. Now let's just keep something in mind. The United States military occupied this area for 20 years. So now think about something. The United States, therefore, as a military force, was on the borders of all of these countries, including China, for 20 years. Imagine if the situation had been reversed. Can you imagine, for example, that Chinese had military forces occupying someplace along the Canadian border, for example, or maybe out near Nova Scotia or something, for 20 years? Think about what the American people would say. Think about what would be being said about Chinese military incursions and threats and nuclear threats and so on. Nonetheless, what's important is that the United States is still there. And more importantly, rather than a simple, rapid, precipitous military sort of drunken pullout, what could be done is to use the moment for a kind of collaboration using the engineering, scientific, and technological capabilities that the American military has always been known for. Let's remember that the American military, from the time of the 1800s, was the source originally of the development of advanced American industrial capabilities, particularly through West Point. The West Point Foundry is one such case. And it was the United States Military Philosophical Society, which included members like John Quincy Adams, James Monroe, Robert Fulton, DeWitt Clinton, who was responsible for the completion of the Erie Canal. These forces were all associated with the United States military. And if you talk to people from the United States military, they will tell you very proudly how capable we are, if we wish to be, in terms of building and constructing. So whether we're talking about rail, roads, bridges, highways, dams, canals, whatever it is, this actually is a circumstance in which one could see an eruption of cooperation, not competition, not the development of new quasi forms of development, which are really intended to, quote, counter the Chinese or something like that. But to recognize that this is a time where, especially if you look at the health crisis of the world, the collaboration could occur. It is, however, relevant that we look at this from a standpoint not merely of 20 years back, at the point at which the 9/11 attack occurred, but 40 years back, the point at which Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was the National Security Advisor of the United States back in 1979, fomented and admits to have fomenting the war in Afghanistan in order to, quote, bring down the Soviet Union. That's what Brzezinski imagined that he accomplished and imagined that he was doing. No such thing actually occurred, but it makes for a good horror story, bedtime horror story for those that continue to try to use what used to be called the military-industrial complex and has increasingly become sort of a military, monetary, narcotics complex. After all, about 80% of the opium in the world comes from Afghanistan. There's no reason that should be the case with a 20-year U.S. presence there. And to claim that you couldn't stop the opium traffic in Afghanistan, people like to say this thing, oh, well, you can't win the war on drugs. It's obvious no military solution works because it's just too involved. What would have been that involved about eradicating the traffic in opium in Afghanistan? So you see that there are other factors and other forces that have been involved, Brzezinski being one of those in particular. We wanted to show some maps right now. We've shown, of course, the map of Afghanistan. But let's just take a look at what used to be the Warsaw Pact nations and the map of Europe, what the map of Europe looked like back in 1983, which was the year in which Lyndon LaRouche proposed the Strategic Defense Initiative. That was a method to render nuclear weapons obsolete and nuclear warfare obsolete. Now, at that time, if you look at the map, looking at the orange color there, you see Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Poland. This was, in effect, a kind of double border for Russia, because this was the border of the Warsaw Pact nations. There were others as well, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and so on. You see them all there on the map. If we go to the next map, you'll see how radically this situation has changed. Now what you're looking at in the blue is NATO. And you see that NATO is on the border, directly on the border of Russia, not the Soviet Union. The former Soviet Union, of course, disappeared and collapsed, but that's not all that occurred. these countries all became members of a military alliance that had been a Cold War alliance. And whereas the Warsaw Pact was dissolved, NATO was not. So therefore now consider Ukraine and look at Ukraine over against Estonia and Latvia. Look at the border, in other words, of Russia. And then look at the other questions there, Belarus, the recent destabilizations that have gone on there. So that one has to therefore revisit and reconceptualize what it means that we are actually engaged in globally. Russia is a nation that has 14 nations on its border. There's another nation very much like that named China, and we'd like to just show a map of that as well, just to again give an indication of what kind of destabilizations go on that are often missing from American headlines. So you see China there in the light color, and you see around it with Mongolia, Kazakhstan, India, very prominent. But again, this is important to understand when we talk about the idea of the sensitivities, both in terms of Russia and China, and importantly, the new alliance that has occurred between Russia and China, which is not merely, as they say, military, but is a sort of shared mission to utilize the Belt and Road Initiative and other forms of economic development as a way of creating something different than military alliances, different than warfighting as a capability. We are going to be having, as we said, a conference next week, which will be dealing with a very specific element of this, because the issue is to look at energy, particularly nuclear power in this case, the World Health Platform, and the ending of war as a possible single task or a single mission. This is the sort of outlook, however, that is now nearly foreign to certainly foreign policy of the United States and even domestic policy of the United States. And there's a reason that it became that way. We want to take this occasion at this moment to talk about another event that will be happening on August 14th, which I believe is 6 weeks away from today. And this will be a commemoration of the 50th anniversary of the taking of the dollar off the gold standard, but specifically a forecast made by Lyndon LaRouche to that effect. Now, the reason I put this together with this discussion you've just heard about Afghanistan is that it's necessary for people to have a larger framework. And so we started with 20 years, which was Afghanistan and the incursion into Afghanistan by the American military. We referenced Brzezinski 40 years ago with the Soviet invasion induced by Brzezinski and company of Afghanistan from 1979, 1980. And now we want to reference something 50 years back, which is the taking of the dollar off the gold standard and the role that Lyndon LaRouche played at that time in the United States in formulating an alternative.
On August 15, 1971, 50 years ago, President Richard Nixon delivered a dramatic 18-minute national television address. It was a Sunday. He announced, number one, that the dollar was being decoupled from gold. The dollar would no longer be redeemable in gold. Number two, that a floating exchange rate system would replace the existing fixed exchange rate international monetary system. And number three, that a temporary wage and price freeze would be instituted in the United States, which quickly became phases 1, 2, and 3 drastic austerity measures. Although Nixon announced these measures purportedly to rein in financial speculation against the dollar, they in fact opened the floodgates to the most massive, lengthy, speculative binge in the history of mankind, coupled with physical economic collapse, which continues to this day.
Accordingly, I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to take the action necessary to defend the dollar against the speculators. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States. In full cooperation with the International Monetary Fund and those who trade with us, we will press for the necessary reforms to set up an urgently needed new international monetary system. Stability and equal treatment is in everybody's best interest. I am determined that the American dollar must never again be a hostage in the hands of international speculators. The time has come for exchange rates to be set straight and for the major nations to compete as equals. There is no longer any need for the United States to compete with one hand tied behind her back.
Nixon's speech was followed by the Azores International Monetary Conference in 1972, which officially ended the fixed rate system, and later by the 1999 cancellation of FDR's Glass-Steagall Act, which put the last nail in the coffin. Nixon's action unleashed an international speculative feeding frenzy that has today driven total speculative financial instruments, such as derivatives, up into the range of $2 quadrillion. That's a 2 followed by 15 zeros. To be sure, there have been other speculative bubbles throughout history, such as the Dutch tulip mania of 1634 to 1638, the Mississippi bubble, 1719 and 20, and the South Sea bubble of 1720. But they were all smaller and shorter in duration than today's monstrosity. Nixon's announcement of August 15, 1971, was the most far-reaching and catastrophic economic policy decision of the 20th century, in terms of its consequences down to the present. One economist, and one economist alone, called it. He warned that it was coming, he explained what it meant within hours of its announcement, and he spent the next 5 decades warning that if those policies were continued, the world would head into a systemic breakdown crisis and the likelihood of fascist economic policies. All the while, he presented detailed programs to reverse the crisis based on the idea of peace through development and on fostering the productive powers of labor of every person on the planet. That man was Lyndon LaRouche. LaRouche was reviled and unjustly imprisoned for 5 years for these efforts. His policies were not implemented in the transatlantic sector, and the planet today is paying the price for that folly in the form of a hyperinflationary blowout, an uncontrolled and deadly pandemic, and the danger of thermonuclear war. As a result of the campaign to defame LaRouche and silence his ideas, although you have probably heard of LaRouche, odds are that you haven't actually read anything that he wrote or studied his writings seriously. But some people, leading scientists and political leaders in different parts of the world, did listen to LaRouche and did study his works. From the Russian scientific giant Pobisky Kuznetsov, to former Mexican President José López Portillo, to former Italian economics minister Giulio Tremonti. The LaRouche Legacy Foundation is proud to announce that on Saturday, August 14th, 50 years after Nixon's fateful announcement, it will hold an international seminar featuring such leading thinkers. You will be able to hear from them directly about LaRouche's economic breakthroughs, about his unmatched record of forecasts, and about his programmatic proposals to develop every corner of the planet and the solar system. The seminar will help you understand why it is past time to exonerate LaRouche's ideas, both for reasons of simple justice and to be able to at last implement his policies.
So that will be occurring on Saturday, August 14th. And let me simply say what we are doing in the way in which we are presenting this is letting people understand that we are all about business. The idea is to get things to change and to therefore give you the necessary ammunition, both in terms of the arc of time over which the things that are happening to you now were actually not only planned, but began to be implemented, but also the solutions that were available to you then that were either ignored, suppressed, or misunderstood. I want to now come back to what we'll be doing next week, because one of the panels of that conference, which we referenced at the top of the hour when we began, which is happening, there is no climate emergency. The first panel is called The Economic Effects of Green, Mutual, and Assured Destruction. Now, the significance of the title is that over the course of the past months, in particular, both NATO and the United States military have attempted to assert that climate change is essentially an international security issue. What, of course, that's a cover for is the right to protect. That is to say, the notion that no nation in the world can possibly rise above the well-being of the whole planet, which, after all, is immediately threatened with drowning or something because of global warming. Planet is not threatened by a coronavirus pandemic or multiple pandemics that may result as derivatives of the coronavirus pandemic or new pandemics. Planet is not threatened by the fact that there's no major investment in infrastructure. The planet's not threatened by the provocation of thermonuclear war. The planet's threatened by climate change. And therefore, from this interest of international security, all nations have to be subordinated to that, including the productive activity in all nations. That's the scam. That's the so-called reasoning. And what we are going to do now is give you, show you what something from Paul Gallagher. He gave this discussion last night at the Friday Symposium with Diane Sayer concerning what the real deal is behind the Green New Deal.
This Green New Deal was introduced with certain promises, certain goals: electrified buildings, electrified vehicles for everybody, electric vehicles for everybody, greatly expanded high-speed rail travel, no more fossil fuel engines and motors. This was the bait. We can have lots of jobs doing all these wonderful things while saving the planet. So that was the bait. But as we showed immediately already in early February in the pamphlet, The Great Leap Backward, which was the name we gave to the Green New Deal, these things were not and are not possible. In fact, these people proposed to increase the total electric capacity of the United States by 50% in order to supposedly give us all electrified buildings, electric vehicles, high-speed rail travel, and so on. The last such increase in electric capacity in the United States took more than 25 years and ended more than 10 years ago, and there hasn't been any change in electric capacity since then. Moreover, they needed to add 150,000 to 200,000 miles of new high voltage transmission lines in this Green New Deal. The most added in any recent year was about 500 miles in 2013. The average of the last decade has been about 200 miles added per year. That's nationally, across the United States. They have no chance whatsoever of doing that, nor would it work if they tried to do it. And worse, they have said that this is going to be done miraculously. This power is going to be added in the form of the most unreliable, most intermittent, lowest power density forms of electric power that it's possible to use: wind power and solar power. In 2020 and 2021, nothing else is being added to a grid anywhere in the United States but wind and solar. And worse than that, the most reliable and highest power density forms of electricity are being closed down to make way for the least reliable, most intermittent, lowest power density forms. You can see where this is heading. Coal is rapidly being shut down, has been for the last 6 years. Nuclear more slowly is being shut down. So what that means is that the installed electric power in the United States for this Green New Deal will have to not increase by 50%, it will have to more than double at the same time as you're shifting and shutting down the most productive parts of it, you're going to have to, at the same time, double it by adding vast amounts of wind and solar power. Then add to the doubling of the total capacity in the United States by adding gas turbine power plants behind those wind and solar plants, because the situation with those high voltage power lines, they are already being overwhelmed by the installation of all these power farms, which produce excessive power when the sun is shining and the wind is blowing, power which has to be dumped on some distributor. And then suddenly when the wind is not blowing and the sun is not shining, other plants have to be cycled up and put onto the grid to provide power to the grid as backup, usually gas turbine plants, but sometimes calling on nuclear plants and even coal plants to cycle up and then shut down again when the sun comes out, when the wind starts to blow again. Everything involved is damaged physically in this process. The congested power lines are damaged. The plants being cycled up and down are damaged. Their lifespan, their usable lifespan is reduced. Now, just if you stop and think for a minute, if electric power was still a public utility function, with utilities that are regulated public utilities, providing the generation of power and also the distribution and sale of it as they used to, no such public utility would ever decide to do what I'm describing, which is what the Green New Deal requires that they do. So the Green New Deal is accompanied by what's called electric power deregulation. It is rampaging through those economies where the electric utilities were long ago broken up. In particular, I'm speaking of the economies of the United States, most of the states of the United States, Germany, the Scandinavian countries. These are leaders in deregulation, and they are leaders in the Green New Deal. Because once you break the regulated public utilities up under deregulation, then you have multiple companies in place of the utility. Some are generating power, some are managing power lines, some are managing the local distribution, some are selling wholesale power, some are selling power to retail customers, some are selling futures and derivatives as price insurance to all the other companies and to the customers. Some are selling smart electricity devices to wholesale and retail customers that will take their thermostats out of their control, and so on and so on. So with all of these companies in there to make profits on every little tiny cash flow of the deal, why then of course you can throw endless amounts of wind and solar power online. You can pretend that you're going to have the grid exactly managed at all times so that it will be getting exactly the right amount of power from this source and that source and so forth. And then we see first in California last summer, then spectacularly or disastrously in Texas this past winter, that when it actually comes to the need for a great deal of power to survive a condition of heat or cold or what have you, ice, that it doesn't work. That instead you get blackouts, you get power lines that are alternately congested and then dead. You get blackouts and people die. As nearly 50 people at least died in Texas in that event, and others in Mississippi in events directly related to it, which occurred at the same time. So what was the purpose of this? It was clearly not to give us all electrified buildings, to give us all electric vehicles, to give us high-speed rail. None of that is going to happen. The purpose, go back to the original Green New Deal proposal, if you can remember it, in the end of 2018 came from Senator Bernie Sanders, Senator Edward Markey of Massachusetts, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez from New York. That proposal said next to nothing about these technologies but it was very precise about the cost of this Green New Deal, $16 trillion. Bernie Sanders, during his presidential campaign, repeated that again, and his campaign staff put it out in detail. $16 trillion was going to be necessary to put this across, and that was going to include, they said, a significant amount of this money to be printed by the Federal Reserve. New money, new currency printed by the Federal Reserve. So the real purpose of the thing is to loot. It's to loot trillions of dollars in higher electricity costs and in carbon taxes put on by governments and in higher prices of related products, and to give speculating companies the ability to speculate in so-called carbon markets. And if you ask, well, what about all the industrial companies that clearly are going to resist this, and they do resist it, because they need high quality power for industrial production, not this kind of chaotic situation? Well, you force them, the Green New Deal plan is to force them to drop their investments and or their products which depend on carbon or which depend on high energy dense sources of power like nuclear. You simply force them to drop it, either by government decrees, that's the way it's largely been done in Germany, but even more by decrees of the bankers of those companies, which will force them, if they want to continue to borrow and sell stock, will force them to drop carbon intensive technologies and to drop the forms of power that the scheme involves. And here you come to the British central banker Mark Carney, his partner Sir Michael Bloomberg, formerly just Mike Mussolini Bloomberg of New York, now Sir Michael Bloomberg of London, along with Mark Carney, who has ascended from the Bank of England and his other central banking posts to the United Nations Global Ambassador for Climate Change Matters. Beginning 2015, right after the Paris Climate Conference, they started forming committees of central banks and the biggest private banks. The premise of those committees was, first, we're going to force all kinds of companies to divulge what they use in their production processes or what they invest in and how much carbon is involved in those things they produce or invest in. And then once we get them to divulge it, then we're going to force it to stop or they're going to be cut off. Mark Carney has said this more than once in public speeches, very bluntly. Those companies which learn to deal with the net zero carbon new paradigm, those companies will prosper. Those companies which don't, they, he said, will cease to exist. And that top down, the BlackRock Incorporated, the biggest financial firm in the world here on Wall Street, has been prominent in this. That combination has forced hundreds and hundreds of companies worldwide to go along with the insanity, suicidal insanity of this Green New Deal. As, for example, now the German car companies are immediately being forced into that against the wall in Germany by exactly those forces. So that's what we are mobilizing against. That's why the restoring the Glass-Steagall Act, for example, is a major plus in this campaign, because those banks, if they are broken up, will not have anywhere near the power that they have now. But that is what we're dealing with. And that's all exposed in the pamphlet that we've had out in mass circulation around the country since February. And that's the weapon that we've got.
So if you happen to have just joined us, what we are doing today on the LaRouche Organization's Manhattan Town Meeting is giving you a pre-conference report on an upcoming conference, which will be happening actually in just 1 week, called The Pathway Forward, Nuclear Energy, World Health, and the End of War. That's actually not the name of the conference. It's the name of today's presentations. The conference theme is There is no climate emergency. Apply the science and economics of development to stop blackouts and death. Well, now that Paul Gallagher has summarily dispatched the Green New Deal. If you heard that presentation, we're paying close attention. We want to, which is the there is no climate emergency side of what we are referring to. We want to talk a little bit about the other side of this, applying the science and economics of development, because development is not a question of just throwing down some concrete or building a highway or cranking out solar panels and chewing gum. The development means something in specific. And it was Lyndon LaRouche that specifically worked on this area. One topic that will be taken up, particularly on the second panel of the conference of next week. The conference begins, by the way, at 9 a.m. in the morning, and then the second session, it begins at 2 p.m. So you'll want to note that and just watch this space, as they say, and go to the Schiller Institute site also to look that up. But the concept of energy flux density, the power of energy flux density, is a particular specialty of Lyndon LaRouche. He had something to say about it, which we're going to just put up on the screen and read to you. In its application to political economy, my method focuses analysis upon the central role of the following three-step sequence. First, axiomatically revolutionary forms of scientific and analogous discovery. Second, consequent advances in machine tool and analogous principles. And finally, consequent advances in the productive powers of labor. So that Lyndon LaRouche made it very clear that his entire focus with respect to economy was on the creativity of the individual human mind, as that was joined through crucial experiments to the creation of machine tools, that is to say, replicable expressions through a crucial experiment of the new breakthrough made by that individual creative mind, and then its application and its assimilation by a labor force, a larger grouping of society, whether that be an engineering staff or it be skilled workmen who worked with that intent to make that new discovery a general, universal reality. And it was this that was the first prerequisite. And in terms of the idea of energy flux density, we want to make it clear that that's not merely a human economic conception. It goes beyond that. The idea of energy flux density is at the very center of all of the developments of the American, Russian, Indian, Chinese space programs. In fact, in a less discussed element of those programs is the prospect for the mining of helium-3 on the surface of the moon, a fuel that could be, in fact, essential to the development of thermonuclear fusion power. And I also see my cat has joined me, so say hello to Raz. That's my security for the course of these webcasts. It's also another secret unknown only to the inner elites. But I just want to say concerning the actually upcoming conference and what it is we want people to do for this conference. The conception is that we are going to be gathering engineers, physicists, activists, people who are working against different elements of the blackout, impending blackouts of various of the states of the United States. And so the conference, There is no climate emergency, apply the science and economics of development to stop blackouts and death, is a Schiller Institute conference. We certainly invite people to join the Schiller Institute as well as the LaRouche organization and to contribute to it and to sustain its activity. The two panels, panel one, economic effects of green mutual and assured destruction, will be a topic discussed by people involved in meteorology, physics, geology, and other sciences. And we will, and that'll be from 9 o'clock until about 12:30. Then the second will be from 2 p.m. to 5:30. That topic is energy, world health, and the end of war, the power of energy flux density. Now, just a word concerning some of what has been happening. Some of you, of course, I think everybody by the end of today will be talking about what's called breakthrough COVID. And if you don't know the term, that means the contraction of coronavirus despite vaccination. Of course, while we know that there's been a tremendous increase in the number of infections coming from the Delta variant of the virus, the other element is that the vast majority of people that are now being infected are the unvaccinated. That's an important thing to look at, but it's also very important to look at politically. For example, take the case of Cuba. Cuba has been working on 2 vaccines, actually 5 vaccines in total, but 2 of which they are relatively confident. These vaccines are different than the Johnson & Johnson vaccine and the other vaccines. The question that some are posing is the recent attack on Cuba partially due to their work that they are doing, groundbreaking work they are doing to fight coronavirus? Why would that be important? Well, if it were the case that, for example, these vaccines have the kind of efficacy of other vaccines, but people are far more, shall we say, trustworthy, or rather find far more trusting in Cuba, that becomes an important element to reassuring portions of the world's population that they can take a vaccine, that they can engage in helping to, in some fashion, control the coronavirus spread. But if you have political interventions going on and political activity going on against that state, then that creates a problem. We don't need this sort of thing. And this is not what the American Revolution was characterized by. The American Revolution was a much, much different state of affairs. And in speaking about this idea, as Lyndon LaRouche did at the beginning, of the combination of the creativity of the scientist and the inventor, and then that being extended to the machine tool sector, and then that being extended to the labor force as a whole, it's important to recognize that that is essentially the character and the purpose, in one sense, of the American Revolution. Sometimes that history gets very much lost, and I think that's very important to state. And what we're going to do today is the following. We have a section from Lyndon LaRouche, from a speech he gave in December of 1985, in which he discussed an element of why it is that the British Empire formed such a different culture from the American. He begins this particular segment in speaking about the period after the American Civil War, 1861 to 65, where something occurred which is virtually unknown to most people who they know about the event, but they don't know the importance of the event. And it was the Specie Resumption Act. At the time, in the 1860s, 1870s, and subsequent to that, British banking was the dominant banking in the world. The British imperial system was the dominant system. The Americans were not. The Americans were sort of the shall we say, the China to the British Empire at that time. They were an emerging force, recognized as the increasingly most powerful economy in the world. But from the standpoint of the global extension of economy, financing and banking, Britain was top dog. And at that point, what happened was that Britain did something to American Reconstruction after the war. They did something to the United States that attempted to subjugate the United States. And some things occurred that are actually the origin of today's American partisanship. That is to say, the thing that many of you have been, and many people in general have been very upset about, the inability to hold conversations any longer in the United States about matters of principle, has its origins in the British manipulation of the United States. So the division you call Republican and Democratic, or conservative and liberal, or right wing and left wing, these things are not natural to American politics. These things were imposed on American politics in the aftermath of the American Civil War of 1861 to 65 by the use and manipulation by the British Empire of the financial system against the United States. And so this is Lyndon LaRouche, 1985, speaking about that and giving a lesson in an American history and the difference between British culture and American culture.
The Specie Resumption Act revoked the sovereignty of the United States in one very crucial respect. By forcing the United States to recall the issues of federal currency notes, which Lincoln had used to transform the United States into the greatest economic and military power on this planet. The U.S. no longer controlled its currency, its public credit, or its national, state, and local debt, or the debt of its own private corporations and farms. The control over the currency, the public credit, and the debt, public and private, of the United States was placed under the control of an Anglo-Swiss Venetian cartel of usurers who used, through Morgan and others, their fingertip control over the gold supply of the United States through London and Switzerland to regulate the supply of U.S. currency, credit, and to cause the United States to be taken over at rock-bottom prices by British, Swiss, and other foreign interests. Beginning in the 1870s and the 1880s, our entrepreneurial industries, typified by Carnegie's steel enterprise, were taken over by these foreign interests. Up and down the Rocky Mountain spine, where the strategic minerals to supply our nation lie buried and untouched, the British, through the Hudson Bay Company, came in and checkerboarded the entire area in terms of water rights and other means, at rock-bottom prices while our farmers went bankrupt. The British and the Swiss took over the railroad system, which had been launched before and promoted greatly under President Lincoln. They ruined it. They looted it. They used it to loot the farmers and the industry. As a result of that process, in the 1870s, beginning 1873, but culminating in the period 1877 to 1886, the United States underwent a social convulsion. The radicalization of labor, farmers, and others, using the representatives of Mazzini's Young Europe to intersect the grave, profound social discontent caused by the impact of the Specie Resumption Act upon the nation. Farmers were driven bankrupt as they are being driven today. They became radicalized. What is called populism erupted, steered from Europe. The labor movement, which had been politically unified with industry under Lincoln, was driven to desperation. The industries were taken over by foreigners through the takeover of their credit and their indebtedness. And so the three great social forces of the United States, upon which the United States had been built, the alliance for common interests of entrepreneurial industry, progressive agriculture, and labor, that patriotic alliance was broken, and the several elements of that alliance were set upon one another. First, farmers and labor were set against industry, and industry against labor, particularly as Morgan moved in to control industry on behalf of foreign interests. Then at the beginning of the century, in the 1890s, the turn of the century, labor and farmers were set against one another. So we had the great, and then, of course, we had the eruption of the Fabian Society. It's an association of mystically inclined irrationalists, which runs under the cover of not trying to create exactly a utopia, but of creating, by some pragmatic process, of moving in the direction of what might prove to be a utopia, but more specifically of undermining and destroying every institution, cultural, moral, and so forth, associated with European civilization, Republican civilization. These fellows were introduced to the United States. Chicago University was established as the Fabian School of Chicago under the British Fabian Society. John D. Rockefeller II was sent to London, where he became brainwashed, became back a raving Fabian, and induced Daddy to give him the money to transform the Fabian School of Chicago, headed by John Dewey, into Chicago University. And then you had Deweyism and Chicago University have been specifically a cesspot of this particular kind of Rockefeller conduited deviltry ever since. They infested our labor organizations, the Socialist Party of America, was an operation created by these people. The British Round Table was the creation of these people. The National Civic Federation, founded in the same period and incorporating the Socialist Party of America, were a direct result of Fabianism. The Council on Foreign Relations was created, again, as a subsidiary of the new form of the Round Table, London Chatham House, the Royal Institute for International Affairs, in the 1920s. And again, the labor movement, the Socialist Party of America, was assimilated in that, just as the Fabian Society of Britain was an integral part of the Round Table, which ran World War I British intelligence in the person of H.G. Wells, and which has run what is called the liberal establishment, middle-class liberal establishment of Britain ever since. So we were radicalized. By the turning point after 1870 was the assassination of McKinley by a crazy Swiss lover of Emma Goldman, who went through the Henry Street settlement house, where he was safe housed in New York City, up to kill President McKinley. Now, the significance of his act, of Emma Goldman's crowd, was that this brought into power one of the worst people who ever was in office since in the United States, President Teddy Roosevelt. One of the worst swine ever conceived on this planet. Under Teddy Roosevelt, every vestige of patriotic institution began to be destroyed systematically. The FBI was created by Roosevelt. The fellow who created for Roosevelt was called Charles Bonaparte, the Attorney General of the United States. Charles Bonaparte was the nephew of Napoleon III. And that is not merely an irony, that's a very clear indication of what the FBI was from the beginning. It was a Bonapartist political police force, aimed to destroy and eradicate agencies of government and private life, which represented Republican institutions. Under Roosevelt, the United States underwent a change, which might be called as our Edwardian period, extending from the inauguration of Teddy Roosevelt as the beneficiary of an assassination into the 1920s, an Edwardian period which ended about 1929 to 1931. The Horatio Alger books are a typification of the shift in mentality which occurred in the United States in cultural paradigms during the first decades of this century. Sinclair Lewis has documented what might be called the American ideology as it was shaped successively by the effects of the 1870s and by the Edwardian shift inaugurated by Roosevelt and Wilson. Out of this came the Federal Reserve Institution. Out of this came a progressive destruction of American values and institutions. The shift was signified by the fact that whereas we had fought 2 declared wars against Britain on issues of principle, beginning with Teddy Roosevelt, the myth was spread that the 2 wars against Britain was a case of some mistake on the part of the British Foreign Intelligence Service. That if they'd just been alert to the matter, there'd never been any issue at all. The fact was that there was a fundamental cultural difference between the Americans and the English, which forced us to a war twice, and we should have fought it 3 times. Because what Britain represented was the enemy of everything for which the people of the United States stood morally and otherwise. And that's why we fought a war, not because of some tea incident or something like that. It was because we represented a culture, a Republican culture, which could no longer tolerate the efforts of an enemy culture, the ruling culture of the British monarchy, to destroy our institutions and destroy the autonomies of the colonies in North America.
A completely different culture. Given that it's still the month of July and people are supposed to be in some fashion recalling the American Revolution, just to give a sense of what that characteristic American culture was, especially in an era when the persons that fought for to create the nation of the United States are all called various things from, all sorts of things, slave owners and so on. Some of them were, but there's an idea of sort of rejecting the American Revolution. Let's use one example, and this is Charles Wilson Peel, someone that you may not have heard of, unless you happen to be a person interested in art. And you may have gone to the Metropolitan Museum in New York City or some other museum and know something about his paintings. Actually, you've seen his paintings, particularly his paintings of George Washington. But Peel, who was born in 1741, was a kind of typical American of the Revolution. And we have a self-portrait of him, which we're going to show. We're going to tell his story a little bit to you. So this is Charles Wilson Peel. This is done at the age of 50, about 1791. Peel could fix watches. He was trained as a saddle, a tanner. He could construct anything. He was a very active member of the American Revolution. He joined the Sons of Liberty sometime in his teen years, and he was a self-taught painter, basically. What happened was that he went to England and studied with the American painter Benjamin West, who was also self-taught. And he became a portrait painter and many other things. He became famous for his pictures of George Washington, but he did other things. He was a member of the Philadelphia militia, formed a militia unit, got that unit together just in time to get to Trenton to retreat with Washington across the river the first time away from the British, and then was involved with Washington in the crossing of the Delaware the other way and the surprise attack. He describes that night as one of the most hellish that he had ever experienced. In fact, at one point, he met a man who was disheveled and in sort of a suit of rags with sores all over his face, and he didn't understand who he was. Then he recognized it was his own brother James that he could not recognize because of the condition, and that was the average condition of the people that did that raid on Trenton with the Hessians that night, Christmas 1776. Let's go to the next one. He painted this is a picture that he did actually of his family. This is in 1782. And you get both his sense, that's his wife, whose picture he's painting, and you see his daughter cutting up in a way that's familiar to all of us that have taken pictures, at this time. But the notion of informality and the self-made character of the American is what's important here. His picture of George Washington, which I believe is the next one, is painted in 1782. And this picture, which is the first well-known portrayal of Washington that gets circulated, was an intentional polemical attack on the normal portrait painting that you'll see of British nobility or other nobility for that matter all over Europe. And it shows Washington just after the Battle of Princeton. The Battle of Princeton followed Trenton. There were two battles of Princeton actually over January 1st and 2nd. And those were battles that happened in which Charles Wilson Peel was also a soldier. And this is a painting that's done much after that battle. The battles were in 1776, 77, and this picture is done 5 years later. Charles Wilson Peel also worked with the astronomer David Rittenhouse in Philadelphia to build telescopic rifle sights. That was how he was. That's the character of the Americans that fought the Revolution. Go to the next one. This picture is a famous picture. This is done by also Charles Wilson Peel. He was the founder of the Philadelphia Museum, and he became a botanist and was responsible for the excavation of dinosaurs in America. You're seeing next to him there, to his left, our right, the brontosaurus bone that he had found in his excavations. And the idea of scientific inquiry, the idea of doing whatever it takes and doing that at some level of excellence, is what people like Charles Wilson Peel represented. This is the American laborer. This is the American engineer. This is the American artist, and this was the American culture of the American Revolution. So this is the idea of culture that we want to bring back to the United States. And so in conclusion, what I now just want to do is to, again, refer to the upcoming conference, which is There Is No Climate Emergency. Apply the science and economics of development to stop blackouts and death. We want you to organize for that conference. There are two panels. Panel 1, the economic effects of green, mutual, and assured destruction, which will talk specifically about how the future electricity security is threatened by wind and solar technology and blackouts. And that will go from 9 until about 12:30. And then panel 2, which starts at 2 p.m., energy, world health, and the end of war, the power of energy flux density. So we want to thank you for joining us today. We want you to help us by organizing for that conference, getting everybody that you think wants to have their lights on continually for the rest of the year, and everybody that thinks that a World Health Platform requires world cooperation, not world war, to join us next week. That's all for today. I'm Dennis Speed, and this is the Manhattan Project meeting of the LaRouche Organization. Thank you for listening.